Bonjour à tous, good morning and good afternoon everyone. On behalf of the Movin'On ecosystem and in collaboration with cities of Boston, Lyon and Montreal, I am very pleased to welcome all of you for this community feedback session on public data and mobility. Next slide, please. Next slide. So my name is Antoine. I am a public affairs manager at Michelin, and I'm also the public affairs point of contact for the Movin'On Summit. And I'm very pleased to be your master of ceremonies for the next hour. As you know, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to cancel the physical Movin'On Summit as it was originally planned on the 1st of June today. But we decided to keep the momentum and to continue to work on a constant basis, always targeting one compelling objective: concrete actions. This is why we selected key physical Movin'On working sessions, keeping in mind our co-innovative approach, and we decided to transform them into virtual community sessions. The coming video with Florent Ménégo, CEO of Michelin, Julie Sweet, CEO of Accenture, Patrick Koller, CEO of Forestia, and Selwyn Hart, the UN Secretary General on Climate Action, will highlight the strength of this commitment of our Movin'On ecosystem to sustainable mobility. Video, please.
The future of the planet is at stake today. We already were convinced of this, and what we experience together increases the sense of urgency. Therefore, we must go even further to make people and goods mobility safer, more accessible, and efficient. We must be the generation that will pass on a more sustainable Earth to future generations. We must move forward and faster towards sustainable mobility.
Beyond the economy, the entire wealth creation for nations is at stake. Their ability to innovate, to develop, to invest, and maintain a social system that protects us all and gives us the ability to build a future for everyone.
The transport sector, which accounts for 28% of global energy-related emissions and employs close to 300 million persons, has an especially important role to play. It's about bringing real economy actors, civil society, and governments together to address a sector that, if we fail in our effort to make this sector a sustainable sector, we will not achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Innovation and challenges are becoming global. Alone, we are nothing. Nations, regions, cities, companies, big, small, or emerging, NGOs, and of course, all of us, people living on Earth. We all have the duty and power to invent the world of tomorrow. We all have an essential role to play together with Movin'On.
I think it is critical that as companies, we harness that power, that agility that we all demonstrated in responding to the crisis, because innovation really cannot be done alone.
Today's fast-moving environment, and in particular in times of economic crisis, such collaboration is absolutely fundamental. We should move towards a new resilient economic paradigm, a more balanced one, not only focused on short-term financial performance, which are needed, but not only, with a model which also considers sustainability.
Today, we all have to change ourselves and to change everything.
Together, we are not only stronger, but also smarter. Collective action is the only way to foster change and have a real positive impact on people's life. And I do know that together, with your help, we will take Movin'On ecosystem to the next level.
Welcome back, and excellent. I think that, as you may have noticed, this idea of Movin'On shared governance is absolutely critical to face our challenges when it comes to sustainable mobility, and it will accelerate our ability to achieve concrete goals, including in the perspective of the Movin'On Summit in 2021. And as we will organize the next Movin'On Summit in Montreal, I am very pleased to welcome Stéphane Guidouin. Stéphane is the Urban Innovation Lab Director of the City of Montreal. Stéphane and his team, together with the City of Boston and the Metropole of Lyon, were deeply involved and committed into the topic today, which is public data and mobility, with a specific focus on public access and governance. Stéphane will provide an overall introduction, and he will explain the why we decided to work together. Video, please.
Dear participants, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you virtually. For the past few years, we had discussion with our colleagues from Boston and Lyon about innovation and mobility. As we were discussing and collaborating on projects like mobility as a service and autonomous vehicle, it became clear to us that data, and mainly data shared between private and public organizations, was the cornerstone of our work. So even if we are from different countries and with different regulation, we face the same issue. Better understanding our cities and taking the best course of action, while data is being collected by cities, by other level of government, as well as private and public-private organizations. On one hand, we want as many data as we can. That's why some cities make mandatory access to data as a trade-off for micromobility operation, for example. On the other hand, obviously, we don't want to be too intrusive, and we don't want to become big or small brothers. We want to limit ourselves to the data that are needed for our policy and regulation work. So today, our expert will discuss the first of 4 elements that we have identified as mandatory to go forward. It's public access of the data and governance. Further, we will discuss mobility data ethics, privacy, as well as standardization, and eventually propose you a data mobility manifesto. We think that Movin'On is the right place to discuss that and bring the topic to the whole mobility ecosystem. I hope that you will enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stéphane, for this great introduction. I think the key aspect is to underline that it's not only a project for today. This project will last all along the year. But now this is the time to bring the 3 cities perspective. On the 20th of May, during our Movin'On pilot working session, we had the pleasure to welcome key experts from the 3 cities, only Lyon, Montreal, and the city of Boston. So we had the pleasure to welcome Pierre Soulard. Pierre is the Urban Mobility Service Manager of the Metropole of Lyon. Véronique Dufort. Véronique, she is the Open Data Team Leader of the City of Montreal. And Christopher Carter. Chris is the co-chair of the new urban mechanics of the City of Boston. Next slide, please. At that time, on the 20th of May, we asked 2 questions to those 3 experts. What is the vision of each city on shared mobility data when it comes to city mobility planning? And the second question was about collaboration. Why collaboration is key between these 3 specific cities? And I will propose you to start with the video of Christopher Carter explaining the vision of the city of Boston. Video, please.
The first thing we wanted to do was sort of ground this in what mobility data is in each of our cities. And for Boston, it's very much tied to our transportation plan, Go Boston 2030. So we spent years developing a plan in collaboration with residents in the city of Boston and arrived at 3 principal goals there. How do we make our streets safer? How do we make our transportation system more accessible and more reliable? And when we think about mobility data, it needs to relate back to those goals. We need to be thinking about how we deliver better services to achieve those goals. And we think that mobility data is one way to both inform us of gaps that we have in those goals and delivering those services, and maybe improve those types of services as new mobility modes come out. I think it's important for us to think about not just collecting that data for the sake of having a big treasure trove of interesting data, but really about delivering back on those values and those goals set by our residents. The second piece for us is about building partnerships. So how do we think about mobility data as a way to strengthen partnerships? And what are the values in those partnerships? I think over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, maybe a little bit longer, we've seen new mobility companies arrive on the scene, break a system, and move fast, and maybe a little bit recklessly. At the same time, we've seen governments sort of overreact maybe in regulation and maybe not be as receptive to some of those new ideas because there's an adversarial relationship at play. We think it's really important to bring those different views to the table, to have a constructive conversation about it, and really focus on building trust, not just between public and private sector, but also with the academic community. How do we make sure that that data that we're collecting, hopefully that we're sharing with each other, is able to spur new research, inform new programs that come out, and make sure that we're achieving our goals, particularly around equitable service in our communities. And the last thing that we've sort of grounded our mobility data values in is about not being creepy. Now, at a minimum, that's about transparency. When are we collecting data? How are we doing it? What are we doing with it? And we've taken some steps, at least in the city of Boston, to start playing around the edges of that, of trying to make it clear when you encounter something, what it's actually there for, what we're trying to learn from it, and what that sensor or camera or something, who has access to that information. The second piece we wanted to touch on is why this collaboration? Why Montreal, Lyon, and the city of Boston? What do we hope to get out of that experience? And I think one of the biggest drivers for us is that ability to learn from others, to be inspired by things that are happening in those cities, whether it's policies around e-bikes or how they're approaching autonomous vehicles and new mobility modes. The second is about being interested in how we can inform data standards as they emerge. There's lots of cooks in the kitchen on this topic right now. And there's been some really great standards that have emerged over the last 1.5 to 2 years now. And we think it's important to be at the table on those conversations, but also think about how we map those values from our city onto what those standards are. Where is data being collected? How is it being collected? How is it being shared back and forth? I think those standards are really important to getting us to scale, which could be really powerful for things that we want to do in our respective cities. The last one, and this really emerged actually last year at Movin'On when we were having a conversation with our peers in Lyon and Montreal, was about how do we draw more people into this conversation? And that was around autonomous vehicles. And we were really trying to think about how do we get folks that don't necessarily care about this topic to give us their insights, their feedback, their feelings, so that the policy that gets developed is better than it would be without that. Now, there's a lot of people that care about mobility data. Many of them are probably here right now. And there's a lot of people that don't know they care about mobility data, but it's impacting their daily life when they hop on a train or a bus or a shared bike, or even in their personal vehicle. And we think that having conversations with those people, bringing them in, trying to inform our policies and our programs with their input is a really powerful tool. And we've taken some steps towards that in the city of Boston, and we're looking increasingly for more opportunities to do so and learning hand in hand with our friends in Lyon and Montreal. So with that, thank you for taking your time today to work on this topic with us. Thank you to Michelin for having us be part of Movin'On for the second year in a row. We're really excited to hear your thoughts and your input today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this amazing presentation underlying the vision and the action plan of Boston 2030 and why collaboration is key, including with the key elements about about the autonomous vehicles the discussion we had last year. Now is the time to move to Véronique Dufort. Véronique is the open data advisor of the City of Montreal, and she will also go back to the two questions about the vision of Montreal when it comes to mobility planning and why collaboration is critical. Video, please.
Merci, Antoine. So on the vision on shared mobility data in cities mobility plan. Well, as a civil servant for the City of Montreal, each day I see need of data to better manage and plan the city. We, the City of Montreal and all the other cities, own a lot of data, but there's many players in the mobility ecosystem and we need to put in place some mechanism to share all together. More than ever, we talk about data-driven decision-making, but this is only possible when we are able to extract value from those data. And also, we have to have sufficient data to give us the right picture, even more with AI. I think that all stakeholders, even the community, by having more information on their transportation services, could benefit from this sharing mobility data. But we have to find a way where everyone find what's in it for them in this sharing. As a city, we believe that public good must lead our action and that we must strive for integrated and sustainable mobility. Data is a powerful tool to achieve this goal, and city must have the ability to obtain what's necessary to the implementation of our vision and mission. And data are useful. In fact, they are necessary for the improvement of services through analysis. For example, the analysis of citizen services data or the analysis to understand the need of citizens. Even the potential of the analysis to improve geographic equity for the access on public transit and the network planning. So we have to find a way to share it more, and this is why we are here today. And we think that by collaborating with the other cities, Lyon and Boston, well, we will be able to find a new way to do. So I think the collaboration between cities is necessary to learn from each other, from the fail and from the success. Here in Montreal, I have a good example where we work with Los Angeles when the e-scooter were arriving last summer, and they really helped us to put in place the API to receive the data. And in front of big industry, well, it was useful to have the experience. Even if we don't have the same legislation in place, sharing of experiences bring value to our reflection. This collaboration gives us the strength in front of mobility and technologies industry, which today have a lot of power and data to lead future of innovation in the mobility area. Cities want to be part of this reflection. From Montreal City perspective, we are the guardians of citizen well-being. Our role is to ensure that public good is put forward of private interest. This means the promotion and the respect of some guiding principle, which we put in a data charter here in Montreal. The first principle is ensuring the human right in the digital age. We include here equity, liberty, non-discrimination, digital sobriety. There's also the principle of the guaranteed of the prevalence of the general interest and public good, which include general interest in the digital data, the sovereignty of cities to have some data useful for the management of the city, universal access, public participation, transparency, interoperability, portability, and even ecological sovereignty. But those principles doesn't exclude that we have to be able to experiment to be sure that we respect those principles and experiment to go further and have a better understanding and a vision of mobility of tomorrow. So this is why I think that we have to have this conversation today. We want to talk about the best way to have a shared mobility data and how we could all collaborate all together to bring value to the cities of tomorrow. So thank you to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Veronique, for this very clear presentation, underlying that public good is at the heart of the vision of the city of Montreal. And Veronique, who is working in the team of Stéphane Guidouin, will explain us later on why public good is key and for which framework. Now, this is the time to finish the global presentation with Pierre Soulard. So Pierre is the Urban Mobility Service Manager of the Metropole of Lyon, and he will come back to the vision of the Metropole and also why collaboration is critical between those three cities. Video, please.
Thank you, Antoine. Data is one of the pillars of a sustainable mobility plan. In fact, we use data for knowledge base to help decision making as tools as modeling, prediction, urban planning, etc. We use also data to operate and optimize even in real time for the transit system and traffic management. And it's also useful to act on behaviors, for example, by implementing mobility as a services. It's also a way to offer new mobility solutions based on sharing, bike sharing, carpooling, free-floating micro-mobility, autonomous shuttles on demand, etc. And now it's more new. It's also a way to regulate the new use of our public space in order to preserve common goods. So these data are produced by private companies or public authorities. Their sharing is a means of having a precise and systemic vision of mobility. It can create new opportunities to meet our challenges of sustainable mobility plan. Why collaboration and shared mobility data is key between the three cities? Because I think we are facing the same stakes. The first one, how to reduce the usage of single cars, but also in order to enhance mobility capacity and support economic and demographic growth of our cities, and preserving air quality and quality of life for inhabitants, and avoid climate changes. So this collaboration is essential for us to learn from each other and sharing best practices. And it can be also a way to be stronger facing global operators by adopting common standards or policies. Some of our tools that we have deployed in Lyon Metropole to reduce the usage of single cars, for example, on-demand autonomous shuttles. We have now 3 regular services for autonomous shuttle. Also by enhancing and developing the bike sharing system, which is called DELIVRABLES, and half of the fleet is now electric bikes. And we use also data to enhance and to promote the usage of public transportation and other alternative modes to reduce the usage of single cars. Thank you, Antoine, for this opportunity to share the experience, and back to you for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Thank all of you for your contribution on the 20th of May. Now this is the time to move to the pure collaborative work. To sum up what we tried to achieve on the 20th of May. On the 20th of May, during our Movin'On pilot working session, we were able to gather around 35 participants, both from the private and the public sectors, multinationals, startups, cities, academics, and we tried to work in a collaborative manner. And the coming video will illustrate the methodology we used during that Movin'On pilot session. Video, please.
conversations around the complex transitions which we have to make.
What do we need to do to make this happen? We need to build an ecosystem, tackle the barriers. So this is the job that's before us today.
And therefore, I'm very, very happy that we are joining forces, TDA with the EV100, the Climate Group, and CalSTAR Drive to Zero in partnership with Movin'On for this kickoff session. And now let's move on.
Excellent. Welcome back. I hope it gave you a taste of what we tried to achieve on the 20th of May. And now is the time to move to the pure feedback session. On the 30th of May, for this Movin'On pilot working session, we decided to work on public access and governance. And actually, we decided to split into 4 questions linked to our main topic, public access and governance. 4 questions, 4 breakout rooms to dedicate time for the collaborative work. Data definition, engagement, trust in local governments, and framework. And now the idea is to go through this collaborative work, and we will start and we will try to see what we learned, what we discovered, and what kind of commitments and actions are linked to those 4 breakout rooms. I'm very pleased to start this feedback session with Philippe Fortin. Philippe is the Open Data Advisor of the City of Montreal, and he will go back to the first collaborative work, the third breakout room, which was absolutely critical on data definition. Philippe, I'm very pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Antoine, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll be talking about the first session that we had on data definition. And I'll first introduce the subject and tell you why it mattered to us to actually talk about data definition. It's been said in the first presentations that the city constantly seeks to improve the quality of life for their residents. And all these improvements are planned in the public interest. This is an easy thing to say, but public interest is not as easy as a concept to define. We've seen it and we've talked about it before. There are new modes of transportation and new stakeholders that have brought new expectations from the cities at different levels, be it security, economic, traffic, utility, public spaces, and compliance with regulations. Cities and Montreal as well have expressed the need for data support to support the planning of integrated urban mobility. And some of these data are only available from transit operators, be public or private. What we try to do with this workshop is actually define the boundaries between data of public interest and what data should not be shared for various reasons. If we could go to the next slide, please. The way we designed this activity was first to start talking about the data sets, which is the part that you see on top. We first, you find some examples of data sets that were talked about, and you may recognize some of them by using it in your daily life or at work. So we talked about road closure, traffic, GPS coordinates, parking zones, even sales from private systems. And starting from those data sets, we then try to see what usage could be done using those. And from those usage, we then try to assess all those usage for public interest or private interest. And you'll see that some of them are on both sides at the same time, which would be pricing and safety purposes, because we find both of them in public sectors and as well as the private sectors. Using those particular usage, we then went to the third and last part of this activity, and we try to find what kind of rules or conditions that we should apply or put in place to make sure that those usage respect the private interest or the public interest. And you'll find that some of those rules and conditions are something that are easy to put in place or could be put in place in the longer term would be ethics committees, find specific needs or aggregate data before sharing it. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'll tell you about the result and discoveries from this activity. The first result that we got is that we should not define the public or private interest based only on the data itself, because the one data set could be both used for private or public interest. So it should really be defined based on the usage of the data set. Based on that first discovery result, it was expressed that the city should define and clearly state what usage they're going to be doing from a certain data set if they want to have access to it. And that there's a lot of rules and conditions that are shared between the public and the private sectors to respect the privacy of the data. Based on those results, if we could go to the next slide, we found out and two commitments and action that we want to put in place moving forward. First, talk and create a data sharing agreement that clearly defines the scope and sources of data sharing. So it could be a document, a base document to start a discussion and making sure that all the different parameters are clearly defined between all of the parties that want to share data and define what the usage is going to be. And we want to also make sure that the cities are the guardian for the public interests. And I do think that the next workshop that are going to be talked about are a good start to make sure that we talk about trust and engagement from different parties and make sure that we get all the right people around the table to talk about data sharing. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippe, for this very clear feedback. And I think it's the time now to move to Pierre Soulard. So we had the opportunity to listen to you, Pierre, just before about the vision of the Métropole of Lyon on mobility planning. And now I'm very pleased to give you the floor about what you discovered during this breakout room on engagement with the private parties when it comes to shared mobility data. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you, Antoine. And first of all, I want to thank again the participants at that pilot working session, and thank you, Micheline, to help us and to help us to continue to collaborate with Boston and Montreal, which is very inspiring. So this panel, this working session, was very interesting, inspiring, with a point of view from public authorities and also private companies and other participants. So our working session was about engagement. And the question was, what incentives could encourage private parties to share the mobility data with cities? Because in fact, data is now part of the tool we have as a public authority to achieve our stakes about sustainable urban mobility. It is important for optimization, traffic management, or transit management. And it is also important for changing behaviors thanks to solutions like multimodal trip planner or integrating ticketing. So our role as a public authority is to make sure we use all the tools that are available. So in addition to public data producing by public operators, we need private data from private operators. Data about mobility facilities, carpooling offer, car sharing availability, airports, e-scooter services, ride-hailing operators, but also data about usage and behaviors. For example, from floating car data sources or GPS tracking, but with privacy purposes. So, and more of the private companies need public data too. We want to also make sure that private operators can provide relevant services based on our data set. Next slide, please. For this working session, the methodology that was proposed was a kind of a brainstorming to fill in those different boxes with examples of what incentives can be tested. So we talk about market incentives, social incentives, technology, legal and environmental incentives. So if we have a lot of ideas, but if we can sum up, and if I just have to keep 3 examples of the main incentive as a feedback of this workshop, I can talk about the 3 followings. Next slide. The first one, what private operators or private data providers expect from sharing the data? Do they want something in exchange from the public authority? So one of the incentives can be a condition that can be to put in place conditions to access some important resources for their business that can be provided by public authority. For example, giving access to public space, like a medallion for a ride-hailing, or like the access for curb for e-scooters, for example, might be provided in exchange of some data about the offer and data about the usage, for example. In Lyon, car sharing medallion is delivered by the metropole within conditions. One of them is that is to share data about service availability and service usage. The second point is about reuse of data. Sharing data is not the only goal. It is also with the reuse that are allowed that make data provider confident with our sharing or our delivering data policy. It can be easier for a private company to share its data if the way it can be reused is clear and convenient within its own policy, and also for us that this the way it can be reused is convenient within the goal of a public mobility policy that respects public goods. For example, one day a private company wanted to have the data from public transport, data which is delivered by the private company, the transit operator. But when we look at carefully on the purpose of this app, the aim was to deliver multimodal information for users. That's good, but also to share the location of policemen. It was a tool dedicated to help users not to pay the tickets. So because we had an agreement with the data provider, the company that operates the network, we managed not to deliver the data to the app. So we cannot avoid such an app, but we want to be sure to be able not to help this app. And the last one is about promotion, image, and reputation. For a mobility provider, be part of the public mobility offer can be an incentive. So by sharing data, it's a way to be part of the promotional tools about sustainable mobility ruled by the public authority. Public authorities so can promote the operators that have an environmental value too. For example, for car sharing, one of the conditions to operate in Lyon is sharing data, and also, if it's electric vehicles, have renewable electricity. So in that condition, car sharing is promoting in all communications that city provides. Next slide. So how can we put those ideas into actions? And perhaps because we are public authority, one of the reflexes is to regulate. Regulation for accessing public space, regulation to have access to our own platform data platform, and regulation to be part of our promoting tool, etc. So one of the points can be that we need to put data sharing regulations in place when it concerns incentives for private parties. But regulation is probably not only constraint, it is also a way to be transparent, to be very clear with our purpose, and sharing the vision for a sustainable mobility urban policy. Another way to achieve this goal can be also to create partnerships, since it is a way allowing mutual and accepted gains. As an example, in France, we have just had a new law about mobility in December. One of the articles is to list which mobility operators have to share that data, theoretical, real-time data, etc. In fact, in Lyon, since 7 years, we have in Lyon more than 100 data about mobility. Public transport, bike sharing, car sharing, parking, long-range railway, airport, etc. But more than the law will oblige to, in fact. And because we managed to build a framework based on license for the reuse of data and an ecosystem build to help to build partnerships between us, our different stakeholders, to create new mobility services. So by a framework about partnership and by a win-win collaboration, we can also manage to have more and more data from private operators. I'll give you back the floor, Antoine.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Thank you for this very clear feedback. I think I'm quite sure that we may have some questions about incentives for private parties to share mobility data. So we'll go to questions after that. But I'm very pleased to welcome Matthew Smith. Matthew is the principal data analyst of the city of Boston. He was also very involved into that topic. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, Matthew, today, and thanks again for this feedback session. I give you the floor to explain to us what you discovered and you learned from that session.
Thank you, Antoine. And again, I'll echo my colleagues in saying that it's wonderful to be here supporting this kind of collaboration, and that the City of Boston sees a lot of value in the kind of work that we can do together to untangle these very complex issues around mobility and data sharing. So the session that I worked on was a good fit for me because at the city, my role is really centered around the data side of things and less on the mobility side. And one of the things that we keep coming back to on the analytics team at the City of Boston is that the most important thing for making effective use of what we can do with all of the tools that we have is the buy-in that we get from the stakeholders. And in order to make that happen, there has to be this mutual bond of trust. And I think that that is particularly important in the realm of mobility data, because this can be very sensitive data. A lot of people really don't like the idea of Big Brother watching them and tracking our every move. And there's also, beyond that obvious element of trust with the public, we also have a bond of trust that has to happen between the private sector and the local government, in order that the private sector gets what they want to out of it, and the public government, we feel that the public good is being served by the data sharing agreement. And another thing that we in Boston are very interested in including in this conversation is a third stakeholder, which is the academic world. And we want to make sure that we're pushing the boundaries of research in this ecosystem of mobility data. So in the workshop, we untangled a lot of those ideas, and the goal that we were trying to achieve was to understand how to promote confidence in data sharing. And I think this links very well with what Pierre was just saying about incentives, because cultivating this trust can be a very strong incentive for all parties to engage in this kind of data sharing. So in our collaborative session, we first talked directly about the public side, the community engagement, and bringing City Hall and the public closer together on these issues. Then we moved on to talking about stakeholder messaging, and this refers to the conversations that are happening between the private sector and local governments, and also bringing in that academic role. Third, we talked a lot about privacy, and I think that that's very natural, and I expect that many of the concerns that the folks listening today have about mobility data sharing relate to privacy and how it can be protected, both on the side of the local government, but also in the way that private companies are engaging with this kind of mobility data. Then we branched off a little bit and we talked about new technologies, both the opportunities and the challenges that are presented as new ideas are being put forward. And a lot of that conversation actually revolved around the new era that we're living in around the coronavirus, because of course, many folks are coming up with new interesting ideas of how to use mobility data to more effectively tackle that extremely difficult question. So I expect that they'll be interested in hearing more about that as well. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about some of the thoughts that we had, the results and discoveries. So I think that what it really came down to for us is trying to break down silos of information as much as possible. So the most basic way that happens is building understanding. So it's not just that we need to make sure that there's transparency on the analytics team in Boston, and also I know that my colleagues in Montreal and Lyon are focused on this very much as well. We have a very robust open data program and an open data policy to try to make sure that as much as we possibly can, we're making our data transparent to the public. But that's frankly not, often it's not enough. We need to make sure that there's a basic level of data literacy, and we need to make sure that when the public is engaged in this, that they understand how that data is being used. So that's all about that second bullet there of community inclusion. And the third question there is about privacy challenges. And we discussed quite a lot of the different standards that are coming about in the realm of data privacy. Most notably, perhaps on the US side, the Mobility Data Specification, MDS, it's coming out of LA. We talked a lot about GDPR in Europe and what learnings we on North America can take from that. And it's very difficult to pull the best pieces of all of these data standards together and try to come up with some way of building a privacy center. But having the perspectives internationally, I found extremely valuable. And I think that that's one big positive takeaway from this collaboration. So let's move on to the last slide, talking about some actionable commitments that we can take from this. So the first is returning to this idea of education and literacy and understanding. And here we're specifically talking about citizens, but I think that this can also equally apply to the dual partnership that we have with the private sector. And there's a lot of understanding and education and literacy that goes into that on both sides as well. And internally, even in local governments, I think a big effort needs to happen to make sure that our workers in the city also understand a lot of these issues, and that will help build trust externally. And the second action that we wanted to highlight here was to make all of these actions user-centric. And at the end of the day, we at cities, what we're trying to do is promote the public good. And we need to ensure that data sharing in the mobility area is in pursuit of that public good. And so any kind of agreement that we make, in order to build trust, the best way to do that is to ensure that the users of that service, whatever it might be, are front and center when it comes to that collaboration. So those are the main takeaways we had from the workshop. I thought it was very productive and interesting to hear from representatives all across the board, and I'll pass it back to you, Antoine.
Great, thank you so much, Matthew, for these key outcomes. It underlines how education is absolutely key for us and for you, for each city. And I propose to move to the last presentation of the breakout room on the framework. Welcome back, if I may say, Véronique. And Véronique, so you are the Open Data Team Leader, of the City of Montreal. I give you the floor about what you learned from this breakout room on framework. Thank you, Véronique.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, everyone, to be here with us today. For the workshop in which I had the opportunity to participate, we addressed the governance framework, which was a hard subject to talk about, but you'll see that at the end we land with conclusion very close that reinforce the previous workshop that my colleague talked about. So we already mentioned it. We think that sharing of data play a major role in the future of mobility. Data is the new gold. Everybody agree, I think, that data are useful, even crucial for the economic development of the cities of tomorrow. But with all the stakeholders in this mobility world, there's a need to have a clear governance framework. So in this session, we had discussion on the main guideline, the condition of success to put in place to ensure mobilizing everyone to share. It's a subject that matters for us, the city, because we think that by sharing data, there's a potential of innovation, which will bring value to the citizens, the mobility of citizens. And we understand that all data producers have to find benefit in this sharing. even if we, the cities, promote public interest. So we want to understand what's the role and the place, the expectation of the cities in this sharing. We can move to the next slide. You see here, this is the result of the collaborative session that we had. We had 3 blocks of questions. The first was only an introduction to see who are the members of this mobility community. The second one was the role and activities in a possible framework that we could work on and the role of the city in it. Then after, we talk about the key condition of success. We want to answer to the question, which governance framework must be put in place to ensure all stakeholders' participation in sharing mobility. So next slide. The main takeaway that we have, well, first you can see it, there's a huge potential of data producer, aggregators, and players that are interested in the mobility data. And it will continue to grow as technology evolves. So our model of framework, there's maybe not only one, but it has to be flexible. Word that also came up a lot was accountability and transparency. So there's a wish that all stakeholders be more accountable and transparent with the data collected and with what we do with data. And there was a kind of consensus between the participants that it's a role that cities should play in the protection of this accountability to be sure that all the stakeholders have the same frame. In fact, what came out strongest, well, at least what caught my attention as a civil servant was a lot of expectation for the city's role. We have to be there to put shared language in place on data. We have a role to define a clear vision based on actor opinion. People want us to be the advisors on the best practices, but people want us to do it in collaboration with everyone, even the citizens. So we can move to the next slide. So in the next step of this Manifesto initiative, we will work on the idea of a framework which include participation of citizens of the mobility ecosystem. We have to work on ethics, data literacy, as already mentioned, privacy. We understand that we need to keep an open dialogue with the ecosystem and work together to build trust. We keep in mind the notion of equity in the application of the framework and the regulation that will avoid favoritism. And this is great because this gives even more meaning to the role of my team in open data. It's a good way to, the open data is a good way to unify the access. So the role of cities is more as a protector and less as a framework managers. So this is why we will have to work on the notion of privacy respect and go deeper in the study of it. And we keep in mind that we are expected to be the keeper of the vision, and we are well placed to promote shared language and data. So this is the main idea of the workshop that we done on framework.
Thank you so much, Veronique. Thank you so much. I would like to warmly thank the 4 of you for your contribution. And now it's time to move to the Q&A. As we have few minutes left, I propose to just to answer to one question, and we'll be able to process and to answer to, we have many questions, we'll be able to process and answer to those questions later next week. So we'll come back to you with key answers relating to these questions. So maybe we can start with, I think, one of the main questions, and which is in common for the 4 cities. what is the biggest challenge with sharing mobility data during the present COVID pandemic time? Maybe Matthew, if you want to say a word about the reaction of Boston related to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Sure. Thanks, Antoine. And I think it's a natural question, and it's one that came up repeatedly during our workshop session as well. Boston is definitely struggling with how to move forward. Considering that our normal public transportation is going to have to shift in the era of the coronavirus. We're already seeing that many more people are starting to use individual transportation. And so the city is really trying to think about how to shift some of the focus away from cars and towards more active methods of transportation if we're not going to be able to use public transportation with the same densities. And I think those shifts are definitely going to need to be reflected in a robust and deep use of mobility data. And many companies are approaching the city of Boston saying, look, here's a really cool tool that we're building. You need to use this to try to solve this difficult question. And for me, I think it really comes down to making use of these new technologies as they come, but being very careful about not breaking any of the privacy strictures that we need to keep in mind. And returning to the subject of what I led there, we need to make sure that there's this concept of trust. So we need to be very transparent about how we're using any of these new technologies as they come. And hopefully that means that mobility data is going to be a really big part of solving a lot of these challenges that in the mobility space that the coronavirus is starting to pose. So I think I'll start with that, but I'm sure that my colleagues have more to say.
Thank you, Matthew. Maybe Lyon, on that question, I know that Lyon is doing a lot of things during this COVID-19 pandemic. Can you say a word about that, Pierre?
Yeah, sure. During the COVID pandemic, we used the data to manage and to be aware and to make sure that the lockdown was respected, and also to adapt our mobility offer on the different districts that are used by the inhabitants. And now, because we are out of the lockdown, and we have to know which is the new dynamic, mobility dynamic at the end of this lockdown. We know that the usage of bike is increasing more quickly than a single car, but public transport is only used by 40% now. So the comeback of single car is a real concern and can cancel decades of public transport policy. By GPS tracking data, we can also have information to make sure where we have to create new bicycle tracks, where we have to enlarge side roads, and where we can close some streets for more comfort for pedestrians. And because also mobility behaviors can be changed for long term because of home office, more proximity in mobility, less mobility perhaps, and less public transport use during the next months or next years, and also probably inhabitants that want to move in countryside. The mobility structure and we cannot use anymore our former modeling tools to help decision making in urban planning. So we have to reinvest from scratch. We have to have new hypotheses, and the new model have to be fitted with data to make sure we can take the right decision in mobility planning.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I'm sorry, because I think we will take time to answer properly next week. I think it's time to close actually the session right now. So thank all of you for your participation. We understood that was the first step, and the 3 cities are currently working on 4 identified areas. So we continue to work in the perspective of the Movin'On 2021. We count on your contribution. And please do not hesitate to find out additional communities of interest that you can see on the screen. And thanks again, and have a great day. Thanks again for your participation.